Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about how peasants endured the brutal trials of plague, hunger, and the crushing weight of feudal lords in the Middle Ages. Their lives, though often unseen in chronicles of kings and conquests, were marked by quiet courage and an unyielding will to survive amid the harshest of odds. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift back with me, back to a time when the world was simpler, yet far more perilous, when a man's word was his bond, and steel sang its deadly song under the morning sun. But before we begin, tell me, fellow wanderer, from what distant land do you listen? And what time does your clock strike as my account reaches you? It brings me comfort to know when and where my voice is heard. I remember walking through the misty edge of a small hamlet, just after dawn, when chimney smoke had not yet risen. The houses were little more than lumps of the land itself, wattle walls packed with daub, thatched roofs sagging under the weight of rain and years. Life here was huddled close, often in a single dark room, where man, child, pig and chicken shared warmth and breath. The hearth was the centre, not just for heat and food, but for prayer, for stories, for hope. Wealth was not measured in silver, but in the narrow patch of oats that might ripen come August. And even then, a frost could steal it all overnight. One could walk from one edge of the village to the other in less time than it takes now to boil a pot of water. Yet within those few dozen yards lived generations. Children were born, baptized, and buried, sometimes beneath the same tree. Old men who had never seen the sea died with earth beneath their nails and heaven in their mouths. Paths were not paved, only trodden by countless feet and cartwheels. The church bell, when it tolled, was not merely for worship, it marked seasons, dangers, and deaths. Beneath its sound, the rhythm of survival beat quietly on. Life depended on fragile balance between sun and soil, rain and rot, strength and submission. A single bad harvest could leave bellies hollow by Candlemas. Illness came not only from plague, but from dampness, from fleas, from the mold in stored grain. The village healer might know which root eased fever, but not how to stop the wasting. There were no physicians for the poor, just mothers with linen cloths, fathers with calloused hands, and prayers whispered over swollen limbs. Despite the weight of the unknown, villagers clung fiercely to each other. Survival was not a solitary feat, but a shared one. Bread was baked in communal ovens, harvests reaped side by side, and when one roof fell, many hands lifted it again. Disputes flared, yes, over boundaries, debts, or broken cartwheels. But reconciliation often followed with ale and apology. There was no other way. Isolation was a death sentence, togetherness a chance at another spring. Most peasants did not read, but they knew the language of weather and soil. A sharp wind from the west might mean blight, just as a thick morning fog might promise a warm day for the plough. They listened not to books, but to crows in the trees, to the silence of bees in June. The land taught them, stern and slow, and they passed that hard-won knowledge from father to daughter, mother to son. Books decay, memory endured. Lords might own the land, but it was the peasant who knew its secrets. He knew where the dew lingered longest, and which patch held back barley year after year. And though he bent his back beneath another man's law, he walked the ridges of his field like a king on his own soil. That pride, quiet and stubborn, fed him when grain ran low. A man may be hungry, but if he sows, he hopes. And hope is a hard thing to kill. Rituals mark the year as surely as hunger mark the ribs. Candlemas, Lammas, St. Swithin's Day. Each brought a rhythm that steadied the soul. A loaf blessed at the altar. A garland hung on the door. A wooden spoon carved in secret for a child's name day. These were not luxuries, but lifelines. Anchors of meaning in a world of uncertainty. Without them, the soul frayed like the edge of an old cloak. So I sat once beneath the eaves of such a cottage, eating coarse bread and warm onion pottage, offered by a widow who had outlived 2 lords and 3 sons. She did not speak of grief, only of weather, as if survival itself had no need for lament. I have never forgotten her calm or the steadiness of that life held together with straw, silence, and sacred repetition. It was a fragile world. But then, most beautiful things are. The path to the manor was one I walked often, though rarely by choice. There, beneath the carved timbers of the great hall, a peasant stood, not as a man, but as a tenant bound by duty. We owed rent not only in coin, if we had any, but in sheaves of grain, eggs, and days of our labour. A life measured in toil, where service was currency and the Lord's favour, a kind of uncertain shield. You gave not only your back, but your time, your sons, your seasons. To live was to owe. It began with land, a patch granted to your father or grandfather, and held at the will of the Lord. It might be a few strips scattered across the open field, barely enough to feed a family. In return, you owed service, ploughing the domain, reaping his barley, mending his fences. Sometimes it was fixed. Other times, it changed with his mood or the manor's need. You dared not protest. Land was survival, and refusal meant none. Tithes were expected thrice a year, money at Martinmas, hens at Candlemas, a sheaf of wheat after harvest. On paper, the manor roll recorded these obligations neatly. In life, they pressed down like stone. One owed coin, even when the crops failed. One owed labour even when a child lay dying. And though it felt cruel, it was called custom, and custom in the manor court was as binding as law from the king. But it was not only the Lord who took. The church, too, demanded its share. 1/10 of all the peasants' produce, claimed in God's name. And though it fed the monks and lit the candles, it left our granaries leaner, our tables barer. To give less was to risk your soul. To give all was to keep your standing. Between altar and hall, we walked a narrow ridge, our steps measured by faith and fear. Still, the Lord's hand was not always a fist. He was protector as well as master, his tower the only stone stronghold for miles. When bandits roamed or wars passed near, we looked to his men for defense. He gave seed grain after poor harvests, tools to the widow, timber to mend a roof. It was a bond twisted with cruelty and care, a knot not easily judged from afar. Our place was spoken of in terms that both marked us and erased us. Villains, bordars, cotters. We were the spine of the estate, and yet seen as chattel. But within these roles lay our inheritance, our rhythm. A father taught his son how to harvest quickly, how to plough a straight furrow. And so, generation after generation, we fulfilled our share. To refuse was not just rebellion. It was a breaking of the world we all relied upon. There were some who ran, fled to towns or forests, seeking freedom. But the Lord's writ often followed. Even distant bells could not drown the sound of obligation. And so most stayed, bound not only by rule, but by the soil that knew their name. A man might dream of liberty, but it is hard to abandon the land where your child is buried, and your sweat is planted in the furrow. I recall the look of a young reeve once, counting sacks of oats with more weariness than greed. He too was a peasant, elected by his kin, hated for serving the manor. There were no simple roles in the chain. We bore the weight together, even when it pulled us in different directions, and in that shared strain, we endured. Not freely, but not without dignity. I remember ducking beneath a low lintel into a home that smelled of peat smoke, earth, and human breath. It was not my own, but the shape was familiar. Timber bones packed with mud, roofed with thatch pulled from the marshes. There was no chimney, only a hole beneath the eaves where smoke could creep out if the wind was kind. At night, it hung in the rafters like fog, stinging the eyes and blackening the beams. The air was warm but heavy, and it clung to everything: clothes, hair, prayer. Walls here were not meant for beauty. They were made by hands, not masons. staves of hazel bent into shape, plastered with straw and dung. They cracked in winter and ran with moisture in spring, yet within them, a family could find rest. A single room held cradle, cot, fire, and meal. Beds, if they could be called that, were often just straw heaps against the wall, shared by parent and child alike. There was no privacy, only proximity. Voices murmured through thin walls, and even thoughts felt crowded. Chickens roosted above the rafters. Goats pressed against the door. A pig might sleep in the corner for warmth, and in doing so, keep a child from freezing. Comfort was found not in softness, but in closeness, in the press of bodies, the hush of breath, the rhythm of the hearth. Floors were earthen, tamped down by feet and time. Rushes were strewn across them, a kind of bedding for the ground itself. They softened the step and soaked up waste, but beneath them fleas and lice bred freely. Still, each week they were swept and renewed. Fresh herbs, meadowsweet or mint, were mixed in when they could be spared, a gesture of defiance against decay. Cleanliness was not absent, only different, and often harder to hold. The roof was both shield and burden. Thatched by hand with reed or straw, it sagged with age, and each year it had to be patched. Birds nested in its folds, mice crept between its seams, and yet in the silence of a storm, the soft drumming of rain on thatch could soothe even the most anxious heart. I have slept beneath many such roofs. Some leaked, others sang. In the small window, no glass, just a shutter or cloth. Light came dim and flickering, shaped by fire and season. Shadows danced on walls like silent prayers. A woman might sit beside the hearth spinning wool, her face glowing amber in the firelight. A boy might carve wood beside her, the blade whispering against grain. These moments, unmarked by parchment, were the soul of the home. Even the humblest house bore marks of pride. A carved beam, a painted cross, a bunch of dried herbs hung above the door. These were not luxuries, but declarations. We live. We endure. We have made something out of nothing. In a world of hunger and debt, to build shelter with your own hands was no small triumph. And to keep it standing, through wind, fire, and time, was an act of quiet honor. One evening, I warmed myself by a fire where the only chimney was the stars above. The old man beside me poured ale into chipped mugs, and his voice cracked like kindling. "We built this house in a week," he said, "but we've kept it for a lifetime." He tapped the wall gently, not with pride, but with affection. And I understood then that these were not poor dwellings. They were homes, fiercely made and fiercely kept. There is no hunger quite like the hunger that knows its own limits. In my youth, I ate what the land allowed, and nothing more. A coarse brown bread made of rye or maslin was our staple, dense, dark, and filling. It was not a pleasure, but a necessity, eaten with hands made rough by soil. When there was butter, we felt blessed. When there was only salt, we gave thanks regardless. It was bread that kept us standing beneath the weight of long days. The pot hung over the hearth, rarely empty, never extravagant. A pottage, thick with cabbage, leeks, or beans, simmered for hours, its flavour deepening as scraps were added. Turnips one day, barley the next. It absorbed what we had, never complained when less was offered. A single onion could flavour a meal for 6. Into this brew, stale bread was dipped, softening it, giving warmth to the belly and memory to the bones. Meat was rare, and when it came, it was usually salted or boiled into the pot until its strength dissolved. More often, we leaned on dairy, curds, whey, a knob of cheese wrapped in cloth. Chickens gave eggs when they could be spared. Milk, drawn at dawn, was treasured not just as drink, but as sustenance for butter and broth. Even weeds, when properly boiled, fed the body. Nettles, sorrel, ground elder. What others now might overlook, we once craved. Water was taken with caution. Wells turned foul in summer, and streams ran with more than fish. So we brewed ale, small ale, weak in strength, but safer to drink. It was the drink of children, of labourers, of priests and paupers alike. A jug on the table, shared by many hands. Its warmth steadied us through morning frost. Its familiarity bound us around the table. In ale, we found not escape, but endurance. Seasons brought changes, small but cherished. Salt herring filled barrels during Lent, their sharpness cutting through the dull edge of winter. In autumn, walnuts fell like blessings, and apples were buried in straw for the months ahead. A rabbit caught in a snare, a honeycomb found in a hollow tree. These were feasts, not planned, but remembered. A day's luck transformed into a week's story. The garden behind the cottage was a lifeline, not a luxury. Herbs like sage and thyme, grown not for flavour alone, but for healing. Beans climbed up poles like prayers. Cabbages formed slow and proud. Each child learned early how to sow, how to weed, how to gather. In every garden lay the echo of a mother's hands, bent over with hope. The soil taught patience, the harvest, humility. On feast days, the table grew slightly richer, bread from fine flour, a cut of meat, spiced with what little could be afforded. Such days were not just for eating, but for remembering who we were beyond labour. We would eat slowly, with reverence, knowing tomorrow the pottage would return. But for one night we dined like lords in our own modest hall, beneath the same stars. I once shared such a meal with a shepherd's family, seated on stools beside the fire. Their bread was thick and cracked, their ale flat, their pot nearly empty. Yet I have never tasted a sweeter spoonful than the one they offered me first. Hunger teaches more than appetite. It teaches gratitude. And gratitude, I have found, nourishes more than food ever can. The wheel of the year never stopped turning, not for kings, nor war, nor plague. It spun on in silence, pulling peasants through the rhythm of soil and season. Winter began the labour, not the rest, ploughing frozen ground with teams of oxen that strained with each step. Spring brought sowing, careful and prayerful, as hands scattered seed that would decide life or hunger. Summer meant hay, the sweet scent of cut grass heavy in the air. But it was autumn that held our breath. The harvest made or broke the coming year. We marked our days not with numbered months, but with the land's demands. Candlemas meant cleaning tools and checking seed. Rogation days brought processions through the fields, prayers spoken over furrows and fences. Lammers, in high summer, gave the first blessed loaf, baked from the earliest sheaves. The feast was brief but sacred, a taste of what we hoped was to come. The cycle wasn't taught in schools, it was lived in muscle and marrow. When harvest came, there was no sleep. The whole village turned out, old, young, lame, or strong. Sickles flashed in rhythm, and carts groaned beneath golden weight. To delay was to lose. Storms loomed without mercy, and one afternoon's rain could ruin weeks of work. We sang as we cut, not for joy alone, but to keep the tempo, to stay awake, to remind each other that we endured together. The grain was not just food, it was life measured in handfuls. Before our own fields were reaped, we turned first to the Lord's land. This was the bid reap, compulsory and swift. Those who lagged were fined, and none dared be last. Yet even in this, there was pride. To be the fastest, the strongest, to fill a cart with speed, these were honours spoken quietly, but remembered long. And when the last sheaf stood, the youngest girl might crown it with flowers before the final cut. A gesture, yes, but one weighted with ancient hope. Between the great labours lay moments of smaller toil, weeding, fencing, draining ditches, gleaning manure and driving pests away. Nothing was idle. Even the Sabbath was spent mending tools or scraping mud from boots. Idleness was not luxury, it was danger. To pause for too long was to fall behind the land's relentless pace. Yet the work taught us more than survival. It taught discipline, patience, and the strange peace of routine. Not all seasons gave equally. A wet spring might rot the seed. A dry summer could shrivel the barley. And when that happened, the memory of past years became our guide. Which grain had endured? Which field drained better? It was a kind of inheritance passed in conversation and scars. No parchment kept it, only hands and eyes that had seen too many failures to forget. The land, in its silence, remembered everything. The saints stood beside us, whether we believed or simply hoped. We prayed to Saint Isidore before sowing, to Saint Medard for gentle rains. Each task had its patron, each fear a name to whisper in church or field. These prayers were not superstition. They were structure, comfort, and a thread connecting us to something beyond the grind of labor. In a world of unpredictability, even hope required rhythm. One evening, as the sun sank behind sheaves stacked high like walls, I watched a boy run barefoot through the stubble, laughing despite blisters. His father wiped his brow, his hands black with dirt, his eyes soft with tired pride. There, beneath the sky's fading gold, was the truth we all knew. The land gives little, and never freely. But those who learn its rhythm, who dance with its pain and promise, they survive, season after season. There was a time when much of the land lay idle, and famine crouched closer to the door. But change came, not with noise or sword, but with thought, patience, and furrow. The old two-field system, where half the land rested while the other grew wheat or barley, gave way to a third division. Now, one part bore winter grain, another carried spring crops, and the last was left fallow. It was a quiet turning point, its power felt not in glory, but in fuller granaries. I saw the difference myself in a village tucked between low hills and bog. They had adopted the new system not long before my visit. The fields, once weary from overuse, now ripened in balance. Barley here, peas there, fallow with grazing livestock. The soil seemed to breathe again, as if the land itself welcomed rest in smaller doses. We marveled not at abundance, but at the steadiness of it. Hunger became less certain, and that alone was a kind of wealth. The greatest gift, perhaps, was not more grain, but more variety. Spring sowings allowed for legumes, broad beans, lentils, vetch. These fed both man and beast, and returned life to the soil. Where once we walked fields that had been wrung dry, we now saw green upon green. Each planting was a promise, and each harvest a quieter fear. There would still be lean years, yes, but they no longer came like wolves, only as winter's breath. Manners adjusted, slowly. Lords, always wary of change, could not argue with full barns. Some demanded more dues in kind, eager to share in the better yield, but even they knew this system required cooperation. Ox teams rotated through many hands. Sowing days were planned aloud, under trees and over jugs. The land's new rhythm demanded unity. It was no longer each man's plot alone, but a dance, shared and seasonal. Children learned it as song, humming the order of the fields while herding geese. Even the elders, set in ways like stone, came to nod with approval. The sight of beans flowering where none had grown before softened even their doubts. It was a small miracle, this modest abundance. A kind of magic rooted not in prayer alone, but in wisdom and practice. Fallow fields were not wasted. Sheep grazed them, leaving behind more than wool. Their dung fed next year's barley better than any charm or chant. The peasant learned, over time, to trust the unseen work beneath the soil. What lay hidden in one season might blossom in the next. It was a lesson as old as Genesis, but newly felt in each spadeful of earth. This shift did not end suffering, but it slowed its pace, gave us tools against its certainty. Where once we had begged the sky for mercy, We now built our own defences in rows and rotations. And though no lord praised us, we felt it in our bones. The land, when tended with patience and pattern, could be more than a burden. It could become a partner. I once stood on a ridge at dusk, watching the light fall over those long, narrow strips. The colours of the fields, gold, green, brown, told a story of balance. Not victory, not conquest, but resilience. In that painted earth, I saw the future, quiet, humble, and hard-won. And I knew then that true revolutions do not always roar. Sometimes they grow. It was at dawn that I would often hear them. Bells around necks, hooves soft against the frost, voices calling across pasture. The animals moved slowly, grazing what the harvest had left behind. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and the rare donkey. They were not just beasts, but lifelines. Their breath warmed barns in winter, their dung fed our fields, their milk and wool stretched what little we had. A peasant with a cow had more than milk. He had standing, security, a shield against famine. Few owned enough oxen to pull a plough alone. A team required strength, and strength required numbers, so neighbours shared. 2 from this family, 2 from that, yoked together in morning mist. I watched them once, walking the furrows, coordinated, quiet, strong. It was a pact unspoken. Share the beasts, share the bread. These were not acts of charity, but necessity drawn from wisdom. Alone, we struggled. Together, we sowed. Sheep wandered the commons after the hay was cut, their hooves pressing seed into soil. They gave wool, yes, but also warmth, meat, and manure. In some manners, flocks were held by the Lord, guarded by boys who slept with slings beneath hedgerows. In others, a few peasants might pool their ewes and shear come spring. The fleece fetched coin at market, a rare touch of silver in calloused hands. A single good lamb could feed a family for weeks. Pigs roamed the woods, rooting beneath oaks and beeches. This was called pannage, and it was sacred custom. Each autumn, we led them into the forest to fatten on fallen mast. Their grunts echoed beneath the turning leaves, and we listened as if to music. For many, pork was the only meat eaten all year, preserved with salt and patience. The loss of a pig to wolves or theft was more than grief, it was hunger sharpened. Hens gave eggs in fair weather, but were stubborn in winter. Their clucks were part of daily life, a rhythm as familiar as the tolling bell. Goats, more common than cows in some places, climbed rocky pastures with grace and mischief. Their milk was strong, their meat lean, their presence a sign of grit. Children learned to care for them early, tugging at ropes and scattering grain with solemn pride. Livestock were not just wealth, they were stories. A prized bull passed from father to son, a ewe known for birthing twins each spring, a goose that returned each night no matter how far she strayed. These animals were remembered in the same breath as ancestors, their lives woven into ours. And when one died, it was not merely loss, it was the shifting of balance. Sickness among the animals could ripple through a village like a shadow. Murrain, hoof rot, foxes in the coop, each brought dread. We tried what we could, charms, herbs, smoky fires in the byre. But often, it was hope and hard labour that saved us, not miracles. And yet we endured, patching together what remained, trusting that the land, and its creatures, would give again. Once, I sheltered in a barn during a storm, curled beside a tired heifer, her breath warm against my sleeve. Outside, the wind howled through hedges and thatch, but inside, there was stillness. In that moment, I understood the bond between beast and man, not of dominion, but of shared survival. For all our toil, it was these humble companions who helped carry us through the leanest years. Across the hills and vales I wandered, I saw a pattern etched deep into the land. Long, narrow strips unfenced and shared. woven together like threads of a single cloth. These were the open fields, where each villager held scattered plots among their neighbours. One man's barley stood beside another's oats, and every furrow was marked not by walls, but by memory and trust. It was a patchwork built not of stone, but of custom, old as the hills themselves. Between these strips lay spaces that belonged to all, commons where animals grazed, woods where pigs rooted, and meadows mown in unison. We cut turf for fuel and gathered fallen branches beneath the canopy of shared trees. Women picked berries and herbs along paths that crossed no gates. Even the poorest had a claim, unspoken yet defended fiercely. The land did not belong to us, yet we belonged to it, and in that belonging found dignity. Of course, peace was never perfect. Disputes flared like summer storms, over whose cow broke the hedge, whose plough wandered from its mark. But there were ways to settle them. Elders remembered boundaries laid before memory, and the manor court listened when voices rose too high. It was not law alone that kept the peace, but the knowledge that tomorrow you would need your neighbour's ox, his scythe, or his mercy. Children grew up knowing each corner of the shared land. They ran barefoot through fallow fields, climbed trees marked for pannage, and learned which mushrooms fed and which killed. Their laughter mixed with birdsong, their chores woven into the greater rhythm. There was no ownership as we speak of now, but a kind of sacred stewardship. To harm the land was to harm all, and so care became a silent rule. In the twilight of autumn, we gathered together to turn out the beasts, an old ritual called the drove. The air was thick with dust, low voices, and the shifting of hooves. I watched once as a lame calf stumbled, and a rival helped lift it, wordlessly. These moments, brief as candle flames, held the truth of survival. We were not rich, but we were responsible, for each other, and for what little the earth gave us. The woods were more than shelter, they were treasure. Hazel and ash for handles, elder for whistles, willow for baskets. Mushrooms after rain, chestnuts in the cold. These were gifts, not guaranteed, and gathered with reverence. To cut more than you needed was to steal from your neighbour's winter. And so, even the axe had rules. I have seen a man fined for taking green wood in haste, not for the theft, but for the breach of harmony. Harvest was a communal endeavour, not just of labour, but of rights. Each strip, though ploughed separately, yielded grain that filled the same bins. Even the gleanings left behind were known to feed widows and orphans. There was strength in this sharing, not softness. It was forged in scarcity, tempered by storms, and made enduring by the silent agreement that no one would be left entirely behind. One winter, I passed through a hamlet whose commons had been seized by a distant lord. The fields lay silent, the people bitter. Where once laughter echoed across pasture, there was only the scraping of cold spades. I understood then what they had lost. Not just land, but the fragile web that held their world together. Without it, they had roofs, but no hearth. Bread, but no feast. Survival, but no soul. When the last sheaf had been bundled and the fields stood bare, the true work began. Harvest was not complete until it was made to last, hidden from rot, rats, and ruin. I remember helping lift sacks of barley into thatched barns raised high on stone piers to keep the mice at bay. The grain hissed as it poured, golden and warm from the sun. There was satisfaction in seeing a barn full. It meant children might sleep through winter without crying from hunger. Not all villages had great structures for storing. In many places, we turned to the ground itself. Dry pits dug deep, lined with straw or ash, sealed with boards and clay. These silos kept oats dry and carrots crisp, safe beneath the frost. It was a clever use of earth and instinct, passed down through quiet generations, and though the work was rough and muddy, it was as vital as the sowing itself. A full pit meant peace. Root vegetables fared better than grain in some winters. Beets, turnips, parsnips, They kept their strength when buried in sand or packed in cool cellars. Each one was wrapped like treasure, stored in baskets or barrels, layered to preserve their life. A crooked carrot might seem little in summer, but in February, it was a jewel. We learned to see value not in beauty, but in endurance. Meat required more craft. The hog killed at Martimas fed a family for months, but only if salted well. Cuts were packed in coarse brine, smoked over green wood fires, or hung in the rafters near the hearth. The smoke cured it slowly, giving it that sharp scent that filled the room with a kind of comfort. We tied sausages with twine, rubbed hams with ash and vinegar. Each bite was the result of days, not moments. Cheese and butter played their part. Curds were pressed into wheels, turned weekly, aged in cool sheds. Hard cheese was worth more than fresh milk. It kept, traded, sustained. Even whey was fed to pigs. Butter, when there was enough to churn, was stored in earthen pots and buried in cold places. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap held a purpose, and every hand had a task in keeping hunger from the door. The smokehouse, dark and warm, was its own world. Fish from the river hung beside strings of onions, and sometimes even herbs were dried along the rafters. I remember the scent: wood, fat, thyme, ash. We would check the color of the meat by candlelight, judge its firmness with fingers trained by repetition. The old men said you could hear good meat as it dried, how it crackled slightly in the night. Perhaps that was just their poetry, but I listened all the same. Children helped too, learning with small tasks, turning cheese, packing barley, brushing mold from drying fruit. Their laughter mixed with the scraping of spoons and the clink of pots. These were not chores, they were lifelines, habits shaped by urgency. Even play was often a lesson in survival. The difference between a spoiled bin and a full one was a child's future, and we all knew it. One bitter year, I met a widow who had lost her barn to fire. She survived the winter on what little she'd buried near her hearth. Some roots, a wheel of cheese, and dried peas hidden in a crock. "I stored hope," she said to me with a tired smile, and I believed her. For in those humble stores, buried deep in earth and memory, lay the strength that saw us through the cold. I was young when the rains came and would not leave. At first, it was welcome, cooling the dust, filling the streams. But the clouds stayed, and the sun vanished behind their heavy cloak. Fields drowned in water, seed rotted beneath the surface, and bread grew scarce. I walked through villages where even the birds had fallen silent, and children stared at empty pots with eyes too old for their years. What came next was not a storm, but a long, slow hunger. The harvest of 1315 failed, and there was no reserve. Granaries had been emptied the winter before, and barns stood hollow as bones. Prices soared beyond imagining. Grain tripled, then doubled again. People sold heirlooms for a bowl of flour, and still it wasn't enough. Bark was stripped from trees, boiled into pulp, and mixed with bean husks to form a bitter, choking bread. Even that grew rare. I saw once a man trade his cloak for a turnip. Livestock fared no better. Fields too wet for grazing, hay soaked through, hooves rotting in the mire. Cattle died in droves, and those that lived grew thin, their ribs pressing hard against skin. With the beasts gone, there were no plough teams come spring, no milk for babes. The famine fed upon itself. No food, no strength to sow, no seed to plant. Villages grew quiet, not from peace, but from the dull ache of enduring. Disease crept in where hunger had passed. Fevers spread through damp cottages, and bodies weakened by want gave little resistance. I buried a friend beneath a willow tree that year, his hands still calloused, his face still young. There were no prayers left in the mouths of the hungry, only breath spent on walking, waiting, surviving. Even the monks grew thin, their arms stretched to shadows. In such times, mercy feels like memory. What haunted most were the choices: Some abandoned elders who could no longer walk. Others fed one child and not another. One winter, I saw a mother give her bread to her youngest, smiling as though it didn't cost her everything. Famine exposes what lies beneath, cruelty in some, but also a courage I still cannot explain. These were not saints, only villagers. But in their silence, I saw a kind of holiness. By 1317, the rains began to break, though the earth was slow to heal. The spring was late, the seed reluctant, but there was planting again, thin, hesitant, trembling. No songs, only digging. Recovery was not swift. It came in inches, not strides. Yet still it came. A sprout in the corner of a field. A child's laughter after a crust of bread. Life, stubborn as ever, rose again from mud. When people speak of kings and wars, they forget these years. No banners flew, no victories were claimed, but to survive those seasons was a feat greater than conquest. We bore it not with glory, but with clenched jaws and calloused hands. It taught us to prepare, to save, to count each grain as sacred, and perhaps more than anything, it taught us what it means to endure without hope, and still endure. I returned once to a village that had lost half its people in those years. The trees had grown back, the fields were green, but the silence still lingered in the spaces between laughter. A woman offered me bread, dense, coarse, but whole. I ate slowly, grateful, for that bread was not just food, it was memory, and mourning, and the stubborn will of those who refused to vanish. After the sickles were laid down and the carts rolled homeward full, the fields were not yet empty. Behind the harvesters came the gleaners, women, children, the old and the poor, bending low to gather what had been missed. A stalk here, a dropped ear there. It was work as humble as the soil itself, yet it often meant the difference between hunger and a meal. I watched them many times at dusk, their shadows long, their movements slow but steady. The right to glean was not written on parchment, but lived in memory. It was granted by tradition, defended by community, and feared by those who had nothing else. Landlords sometimes challenged it, sending men to guard the fields or chase off the weary. But in most villages, even the Lord's steward looked the other way. For to deny gleaning was to deny mercy, and the village needed both law and compassion to survive. Beyond the fields, the hedgerows held their own kind of bounty. Berries clung to thorny branches, nettles rose in shady corners, and wild garlic lined the paths. These were gathered with care. Knowledge passed not through books, but through hands and tongues. A girl learned which mushrooms to trust and which to fear, which leaves soothed wounds and which stung the skin. There was wisdom in those baskets, carried home at twilight. Hazelnuts fell in early autumn, and children scrambled to gather them before the squirrels. In spring, dandelion greens and chickweed found their way into pottage. We did not call it foraging then, it was simply living. Every corner of the land was scanned with hungry eyes, not for riches, but for sustenance. Even the bark of trees, scraped and dried, could stretch flour in a lean year. There were risks, of course. A wrong route could bring illness. A nettle sting could fester if not cared for. But the knowledge of plants and seasons ran deep. I once knew an old woman who could feed a family for a week from the woods alone. She spoke to the trees as if they were old friends, and perhaps they were. To her, the forest was not wild, it was generous. The manor court sometimes ruled against those who gleaned too freely or too soon. Fines were levied for trespass or for gathering before the last sheaf had been carted. Yet the people persisted, because they had to. Hunger does not wait for permission. And often, behind the rules, there was understanding. A lord might turn his back. A reeve might forget to watch. Not all mercy wears a smile. I recall a mother wrapping her child in a shawl and walking miles for a handful of wild apples. Her hands were scratched, her feet blistered, but she returned with enough to stew. That night her hearth smelled sweet, and her boy fell asleep with juice on his chin. It was not abundance, it was survival. And in those simple acts, there was something noble. So much was gathered from places others passed by, from ditches, from wood edges, from the forgotten cracks in the world. The rich had their markets, but the poor had their memory, their knowledge, and their courage. And that, I have learned, is sometimes the finer wealth. For when all else fails, it is often the overlooked that saves us. I once took shelter beneath the stone arch of a Benedictine abbey as snow began to fall. The monk who found me didn't ask my name, only if I had eaten. He returned with a bowl of pottage and a heel of bread, handed in silence, yet warmer than many words. These moments of kindness were not rare. The monasteries, for all their rituals and wealth, held within their walls a duty to feed the hungry and mend the broken. Each day, the abbey gates opened to the poor. Pilgrims, widows, beggars, and travellers lined the walls, bowls in hand, eyes lowered. The monks gave out food, sometimes thin stew, sometimes cheese or dried beans. On feast days, the portions swelled with meat or spiced cakes, and for a few moments, the courtyard felt like heaven's table. This giving was not charity alone, but obligation. Christ was seen in every hungry face. The monasteries owned much land, and with it, responsibility. Their rents funded hospitals and hospices. Their gardens grew both medicine and mercy. Herbs dried above warm ovens, and remedies were mixed with prayer. A peasant with festering wounds or aching joints might find balm within cloistered walls. The monks did not promise miracles, but they offered clean linen, quiet, and care. And in an age where illness meant abandonment, that was grace enough. Not all help came freely. Some monasteries demanded confession, or service, or attendance at Mass. Yet most did not turn away those in true need. I saw once a man give his last egg to a friar, only to have it returned, cooked, with a blessing. The exchange was more than food. It was recognition, a soul acknowledged, a body sustained. Such acts linger longer in memory than sermons. Many villagers gave what they could to the church, not only out of fear, but out of custom. A few eggs in spring, a wedge of cheese, a handful of beans. These small gifts found their way to the poor through the almoner's hand. And though some said the church hoarded more than it gave, there were always those who tried, who believed that salvation lay as much in feeding mouths as in chanting psalms. Children grew up watching this rhythm, the poor queuing at the gate, the monk with his ladle. The quiet thank yous whispered in frost. It taught them that mercy was part of faith, that the holy lived not just in stained glass, but in steam rising from a wooden bowl. Even the hardest hearts softened in that place, if only for a moment. I remember one evening, cold and grey, when a young monk slipped me an apple beneath his robe. "For the road," he whispered, and I nodded without speaking. That fruit, bruised and small, was the sweetest I ever tasted. It carried the warmth of compassion, wrapped in the simplicity of an outstretched hand. No relic, no sermon, no gilded cross could match its worth. Long after the abbey bell had stopped tolling in my ears, I carried its echoes with me, not in prayers remembered, but in acts received. For in a world built on labour and loss, these quiet offerings, bread, balm, kindness, were sacred. And those who gave them, whether in robe or rags, were the true stewards of heaven on earth. Each year, as the harvest was brought in and barns began to fill, a different reckoning arrived, quiet, expected, and heavy. 1/10 of all we grew, raised, or gathered belonged to the church. Not as a request, but as a commandment wrapped in scripture and tradition. The tithe. It was measured in sheaves, in eggs, in wool, and sometimes coin, though coin was rare. I remember standing in line with my father, our offering bundled in rough cloth, eyes cast low. Tithe barns loomed large in many villages, great timbered halls where the church stored its share. They were not sacred like chapels, but they held the weight of souls nonetheless. To withhold a tithe was to risk both censure and sin, to stand accused not only before men, but before God. And so, even when the granary was near empty, the church's portion was set aside first, hunger deferred, piety fulfilled. Some priests were kind. They saw the strain and offered forgiveness, or allowed a delay. Others were stern, counting every bundle with a sharp eye and a ready ledger. Disputes rose like steam. Was this egg fresh, this wool enough, this weight honest? But few dared to challenge openly. The church was more than faith. It was power, structure, a presence that touched every corner of village life. Its demands were not optional. We tithed not just crops, but life events. A marriage, a birth, even a death. All required offerings. A new calf, a basket of apples, a copper penny when it could be spared. And beyond the tithe, there were other dues, plough pennies, candles for saints' days, coin for masses for the dead. These costs bled into one another, indistinct and unending. Some joked that even the devil took less. Yet even in this burden, there was purpose. The tithe fed monks and paupers, repaired the chapel roof and lit the altar. It paid the priest who baptized our children and buried our old. In its best form, it was a cycle of giving that sustained both body and soul. And though we grumbled, as all men do, it kept a structure standing in a world that often threatened to collapse. I knew a widow once who brought her tithe in herbs, bundles of sage, marjoram, and thyme. She had no grain, no beasts, but the priest accepted them with a nod. Her hands trembled, but she walked away lighter, not because the debt was gone, but because the offering had been received. There is dignity in giving, even when one has little, and dignity was scarce in lean seasons. At times, disputes over tithes reached the manor court, where villagers argued over what had been given and what withheld. These hearings were tense, for the church rarely lost, but they reminded us that tithes were not just divine. They were woven into law, enforceable as any rent or labour due. The soul and the soil were bound together by rules we did not write, but could not ignore. One autumn, as leaves curled gold and brown, I helped carry a sack of barley to the tithe barn. The sun was low, and smoke rose from chimneys like prayer. We passed a girl clutching apples in her apron, headed the same way. I remember thinking then that giving should not feel so hard. Yet we gave, again and again. Not out of wealth, but from a desire to remain part of something larger than ourselves, even if it cost us. Beneath the old oak near the churchyard, benches were laid, and the steward's scrolls were unrolled. The manor court had gathered. Not in grandeur, but in order. Peasants, reeve, bailiff, and sometimes the Lord himself. It was not a distant king's justice, but a local reckoning, shaped by soil and memory. I watched many stand to speak, some trembling, some defiant, all bound by the rules that governed every furrow, fence, and fire. Disputes were varied and constant. A cow trampling a neighbour's field, ale brewed too weak or too strong, timber taken without leave, entry fines for a newly inherited plot. Even words spoken in anger could be judged, and though the punishments were often fines, they carried weight, for coin was scarce. What seemed small in a parchment record could cost a family's supper. There was formality, yes, but also familiarity. The steward read the charges with solemn voice, but all present knew the story already. It had been spoken over fences, at wells, whispered in barns. Still, the court gave it shape, gave it end. There was comfort in the ritual, even when the verdict hurt. Justice in this world was not perfection. It was continuity, a way to keep the wheel turning. The manor rolls recorded it all in careful Latin, names etched beside deeds both petty and grave. I once saw my own name, misspelled but unmistakable, beside a complaint over stolen firewood. I had taken it, that was true. Winter was sharp, and the woods too distant. I paid the fine in beans and silence. And from that day, I learned to ask first, or to take less. Yet the court did more than punish. It confirmed customs, upheld rights, resolved inheritance. When a widow took over her husband's land, the court made it known. When new boundaries were agreed, they were spoken aloud and written down. In this way, the village remembered, not in memory alone, but in structure. Each ruling was a thread in the cloth of the community. Some peasants used the court not with fear, but with purpose. To defend a right to pasture, to challenge an unjust toll, to settle debts before they became wounds. I recall a woman who stood, steady and stern, and won back her garden path from a neighbor who had fenced it in. Her voice never trembled, and when the court ruled in her favor, she bowed once and left without a smile. Justice had spoken. Children watched from the edges, their eyes wide, absorbing what words could not teach. They saw that order was built not only on muscle or favor, but on speech and listening. That even the lowborn could be heard, if not always obeyed. These lessons ran deep, deeper than scripture in some ways, for the manor court was where daily life was measured, mended, and sometimes made whole again. One spring morning, I returned to that same tree and watched the court once more. New faces stood where old ones had sat. The steward's robe was patched, the benches worn, but the rhythm remained. Disputes were aired, wrongs balanced, and the roll continued its tale. In that continuity, I felt a quiet kind of peace, for though the law was not always fair, it was familiar, and in its turning, we found our place. When the sun broke over the hills in late summer, it was not our own fields we walked toward, but those of the Lord. The corvée, as it was known, required our hands for his harvest before we could tend our own. We carried sickles and scythes, not with joy, but with resignation. The domain fields stretched wide, often the best soil in the region. To leave them unharvested would bring punishment and delay our own survival. Each family was expected to send workers, sons, daughters, even the elderly if able. From dawn until dusk, we cut, bound, and hauled under the steward's eye. There were no shortcuts. The work was hard, but the rhythm of it numbed the mind. Sometimes the Lord provided ale or a wedge of cheese. Other times, nothing. Yet we came, because the land was not ours alone. It was borrowed, with service woven into its price. I remember one year when rain threatened the barley, and we were summoned early. We worked through the storm, soaked to the bone, mud clinging to every step. A boy slipped and broke his arm, but still his sister stayed until the last sheaf was taken. No one asked if it was fair. Fairness was not part of the agreement, only endurance was. Not all seasons were equal. During sowing and haymaking, we were again called to serve. Harrowing the soil, stacking the hay, repairing the Lord's fences, all duties expected and enforced. Refusal brought fines, or worse, the loss of land. And so, even after illness or injury, men rose before light to report to the manor, tools in hand, silence on their tongues. There were days when service was less harsh, called boon days, when the Lord gave food or drink in return. These were not gifts, but gestures, tokens of acknowledgement. A warm bowl of pottage, a shared loaf. They didn't lighten the load, but they softened it just enough. In those moments, a flicker of human understanding passed between master and servant. Despite the burden, skills were learned in the Lord's fields. New ploughing methods, better seed spacing, sharper tools. A man watched, remembered, and brought the knowledge home. And among the workers, bonds formed. Hands passed tools, shoulders leaned together under hay bales. Though we labored for another's profit, we also strengthened our own quiet fellowship. I knew a man who counted his years, not in winters, but in corvée seasons. 37 harvests for the Lord, he said once, and 5 that were mine. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of weary pride. He had met his duty, survived its cost, and raised a family within its shadow. Such men were the true pillars of the manor. When I think of those days now, I do not remember the weight of the sheaf or the ache in my back. I remember the sun on the fields, the murmur of voices as we worked side by side, and the way we stole moments of laughter even under command. In a life carved from service, we found pieces of freedom, not in ownership, but in shared labor, in quiet strength, in finishing the task and walking home together. I was not far from Paris when news of the Jacquerie reached us. Villagers with pitchforks rising against the nobility, their fury raw and sudden. Word spread faster than carts could carry it, whispered in barns and shouted in taverns. Some called it madness, others a reckoning long overdue. These were not soldiers, but fathers and sons, driven by hunger, by humiliation, by years of forced silence. And for a brief moment, that silence broke. The fields had grown heavy with burdens, war taxes, labor dues, and the sharp sting of cruelty from those above. Knights returned from campaigns, hardened and reckless, taking what they pleased. The peasants bore it, season after season, until one summer the weight became too much. Scythes became swords. Manors burned. The countryside roared. I passed a burned granary once, smoke still curling, the air thick with scorched grain and defiance. In England, it was no different. I remember the year 1381, when the peasants' revolt shook the land. Wat Tyler led thousands to London, voices raised not in plea, but in demand. They sought an end to poll taxes, to villanage, to the endless climb with no summit. Their march was swift and unrelenting. Clerks trembled, lords fled, and for one heartbeat, the realm listened. Even the king met them, boy though he was, face to face. What struck me most was the order. These were not drunken mobs. They marched with purpose, guarded churches, demanded fair treatment. But the crown answered with deception. Tyler was slain during parley, and the promises made dissolved like mist. Reprisals followed. Gallows stood where banners once waved. Yet something had changed, not in law, but in spirit. The memory lingered, like a fire banked, but never forgotten. I heard tell of other risings, smaller, quieter, but no less fierce. A village refusing to send its men to labour, a tenant challenging his rent in the manor court. These were not written into grand histories, but they carved their mark in hearts and habits. Fear of revolt made even the harshest lord pause. For when the ploughman stands tall, the throne feels less secure. Many who rebelled paid the price. Lands seized, families scattered, names struck from rolls. Yet martyrdom was not their aim, dignity was. They wished not for power, but for fairness, for the right to eat what they grew, to walk unchained across fields they tilled. Their courage was not born of anger alone, but of a longing for something better than survival. Even those who stayed behind, who did not march or burn, felt the tremor. They looked at their own lives with sharper eyes. The revolt planted seeds, not of hatred, but of awakening. The old order still stood, but its roots had weakened. A single voice raised in defiance could no longer be dismissed as folly. It became a warning, a question, a sign of change. Years later, as I sat among villagers recounting those days, I saw no regret in their eyes, only memory, heavy and proud. They had not won the war, but they had spoken the truth. And sometimes, truth shouted from the fields is enough to crack stone, even if it takes generations for the walls to fall. It began with whispers, rumors carried by merchants and monks, tales of a sickness far to the east. Few believed it at first, but then the ships came, and the sickness with them. I was in a market town when the first bodies fell, blackened and swollen, breath rattling like broken wind bells. The fear spread faster than the disease. Within weeks, silence fell where laughter had once lived, and the streets emptied into shadow. No village was spared. One by one, cottages locked their doors, not against thieves, but against breath. The baker's fire went cold. The bell ringer stopped tolling. Graves filled faster than they could be dug, and men who had never prayed before knelt in fields, begging the sky for mercy. Carts rolled slowly through the lanes, piled with the lifeless, wrapped in linen if there was time, in rags if not. I saw men abandon their kin, mothers leave sickened babes, priests flee their flocks. Not from cruelty, but terror beyond reason. Some lit fires in their homes, believing smoke would cleanse the air. Others drank deeply, danced, or confessed sins never spoken aloud. Yet the sickness came all the same, through doorways, through dreams, through the breath of a friend. There was no pattern, only loss. The swellings, those dreaded buboes, came fast. Groin, neck, armpit. Burning fevers followed, then blood, delirium, and death. Some were gone within a day. Others lingered, moaning through night after night. We learned to recognize the scent before the signs. It clung to cloth, to skin, to the very air. And once you smelled it, it was already too late. Villages vanished. Entire households died, their hearths left to smoulder, chickens pecking at closed doors. Fields lay untended, oxen wandering without plough or tether. In the worst weeks, I walked for miles without seeing a soul. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. Even the birds seemed quieter. Even the dogs mourned. And yet some survived. No one knew why. A child would recover where 10 adults perished. A beggar untouched while a lord withered. It humbled us all, stripping away the illusion of order or justice. Death had no rank, no mercy. It came for the devout and the defiant alike. And still, the world turned. The sun rose over empty fields, casting light on towns that no longer breathed. When the first wave passed, we stumbled back into life, changed, broken, but breathing. We dug graves for those we loved, mended roofs, rekindled hearths, but nothing felt familiar. The faces were fewer, the silence deeper. The plague had not just killed, it had emptied the very rhythm of the world. And we, those who remained, were tasked with remembering. I still dream of that time, of the hush, the fear, the smell of damp cloth over mouth and nose. But more than that, I remember the resilience. The girl who sang through fever. The old man who tended goats when no one else would. The woman who carried her neighbor's child when all others fled. In that darkness, a strange light persisted, not loud, not bright, but unyielding. It was the will to live. I remember the smell of rosemary pressed into cloth, worn close to the neck as if it could turn death away. The herbs were gathered with trembling hands. Lavender, sage, thyme, tied into bundles or stuffed into pockets. We carried them not for beauty, but for defense. Some believed they could cleanse the air, others that they masked the scent of doom. In times when no cure could be found, even fragrance became a shield. Rose vinegar was prized, made from petals soaked in sharpness and sealed in glass. People washed their faces with it, dipped cloths, soaked feet. It burned the nose and left a bitter trail, but it brought a sense of control. I saw midwives sprinkle it on doorways and priests carry flasks during last rites. Whether it helped or not, it gave purpose. And in chaos, purpose can be a kind of balm. Church bells rang not only for the dead, but to drive out the sickness. Their echo filled the valleys, sharp and desperate. Some said the sound split the foul air. Others said it summoned angels. I rang a bell once, in a chapel that smelled of wax and sorrow. With each toll, I felt less afraid, not because I believed it would save me, but because the rhythm pushed back against the silence of dread. Flagellants marched through towns, their backs bleeding, their songs rising like smoke. They begged forgiveness for the world's sins, believing the plague was a scourge sent from heaven. I watched them once, eyes wild with grief and fever, lashes falling in rhythm. Not all welcomed them. Some feared their gatherings drew more disease, but none could ignore their sorrow. They were a mirror to our own terror made visible. Others turned inward. Small altars sprang up in homes, candles flickering beside bits of bone or relics bought on desperate pilgrimages. Saints were invoked by name, Sebastian for plague, Roch for recovery, Mary for mercy. Families knelt together, not always knowing the words, but hoping they might be heard. It wasn't about certainty, it was about the need to speak when death came close. In some places, people lit fires in the streets to drive away the poisoned air. Smoke curled over cobblestones, thick with resin and pine. I saw one town keep a blaze burning for 9 days straight, fed by every household. Even the poor brought sticks. They believed fire cleansed, as it always had, from rot, from rats, from unseen evil. And in that belief, there was unity. Children sang rhymes about the sickness, too young to grasp its depth, but old enough to sense its reach. I heard one girl humming softly as she gathered nettles, her song naming herbs, saints, and charms. It was a lullaby shaped by fear, made gentle by melody. We did not silence them. Their songs gave us something we could not say ourselves. Years later, I came upon a satchel filled with dried posies, brittle and scentless. I held them gently, as one might a letter from the dead. These were not cures, nor spells, nor science. They were memory. They were love, gathered from hedges and hope, stitched into daily life. And though the sickness passed, the need to hold on to meaning did not. Some things, even in dying, endure. There came a time when the greatest act of mercy was to close a gate and keep it closed. Entire villages, fearing the breath of strangers, sealed their borders with prayer and timber. I passed one such place in the depth of a plague year. A sign hung from a tree, scrawled in charcoal, "No passage, sick within." The road was silent, the air heavy. Inside, they waited, not to escape death, but to contain it. Households that showed signs of illness shuttered their windows, bolted their doors. Food was left at thresholds by neighbors too afraid to knock. Children peeked through slats, watching the world move without them. Some marked their doors with chalk crosses, others hung branches above to signal danger. There was no law commanding this, only a shared instinct that safety came through stillness and distance. I knew a family that lived 2 weeks on stored barley and rainwater. The father fell ill first, then the mother. The children tended them in silence, refusing to open the door even when others begged them to flee. They lit candles in the window at night, a signal that they were still alive. When the candles stopped, the village mourned. They never reopened the house. In towns, whole parishes established cordons. Watchmen stood at entrances, cloaks drawn high, eyes wary. Markets moved outside walls. Coins were dropped in bowls of vinegar, goods placed on stones and collected at a distance. It was a clumsy choreography, but it kept life moving. Survival became a dance of caution, measured in paces and patience. There were those who defied the rules, desperate, lost, or simply unwilling to wait. Some fled to woods, others sought shelter with kin in distant villages. But fear traveled faster than they did. I heard of a man beaten for approaching a well, not out of cruelty, but panic. The plague had stripped away the layers of civility. What remained was raw, trembling instinct. Yet even in this fear, there were acts of quiet courage. A widow who baked bread and left it at 10 doorsteps each dawn. A boy who tended the animals of a neighbor too sick to stand. They wore rags over their mouths and whispered prayers with every step. No one thanked them, but no one forgot them either. In the records of that time, their names are lost, but their grace lingers. The church, when it could, supported such efforts. Bells marked days of isolation. Priests gave blessings from a distance, raising hands over hedgerows. Sermons were spoken to empty streets. Faith became a quiet presence, stripped of grandeur. And in that simplicity, it felt closer, less about ritual, more about endurance. God, if he listened, surely heard us best when we were silent. I rode through one village where no one had died, not because they had been spared, but because they had chosen to suffer alone. Their fields were overgrown, their homes shuttered, their churchyard untouched. They had given up communion with the world to keep the world safe. I bowed my head as I passed. There was no monument to their sacrifice, only the wind through the grass and the quiet dignity of restraint. Graves once dug with care became trenches, long, hurried, and filled by the dozen. I watched strong men tremble as they lowered bodies without name or shroud. There was no time for ritual, no priest for every soul. The dead came faster than we could bury them. In some places, carts tipped their cargo into the earth like firewood, and still, we dug. To bury was the last mercy we could offer. Yet even in haste, dignity clung to us. Bodies were often aligned east to west, as tradition demanded, facing the rising sun and the promise of resurrection. Some were wrapped in linen, some only in the clothes they wore when fever took them. A few had a cross of twigs laid on their chest, or a stone placed over closed eyes. We could not give them all the rites, but we gave what we could. Thornton Abbey, long after I first walked its grounds, revealed such a pit, a silent testimony beneath the grass. Dozens laid in rows, shoulder to shoulder, as if asleep. They had not been forgotten, merely hidden, buried beneath generations of footsteps and forgetfulness. When I visited, centuries later, the air still felt hushed, as though the earth remembered their names even when we did not. In cities, the bells rang until there were no more to toll them. Gravediggers died as fast as the sick. Churchyards overflowed, and new ground was claimed. Meadows turned to cemeteries, gardens to resting places. In some towns, the dead were buried outside the walls, in fields marked only by wooden posts. The wind carried prayers that were never spoken aloud, and the silence was its own benediction. Some clung to the rites with all their strength. I saw a friar bury 3 brothers with psalm and incense, though he coughed between verses and swayed with fever. He would not abandon the duty. "If I forget them," he whispered, "who will remember me?" His words echoed in my bones, and I have carried them since. In death, we saw ourselves reflected too clearly to look away. Children were buried with dolls, mothers with their infants in arms. The rich fared no better than the poor when the sickness came, but their graves sometimes bore carvings or stone. The rest faded into earth, names lost but not unloved. Memory, in those years, lived not in monuments, but in stories passed over bread, in songs, in the ache of an empty chair. I helped dig once, when all others were gone. The man we buried had no kin left. I said a prayer I barely remembered and placed a coin beneath his tongue, an old custom for the journey ahead. He was light in my arms, as if already fading. I did not know his name, but when the earth closed over him, I whispered one anyway, so he would not be alone. There is a quiet that follows great death, heavier than mourning. It settles in the trees, in the folds of clothing untouched, in the soft sweep of broom against chapel floor. And yet, from that quiet, we rebuilt. The dead did not return, but they remained, with us, within us. Not in fear, but in the steadiness of memory. For we had seen the worst, and still, we found ways to honor those we lost. When the plague loosened its grip, the world it left behind was quieter, but not the same. Fields stood waiting, half sown, half reaped, with fewer hands to tend them. Where once 10 men had shared a plough, now there were 2. And those who survived found themselves needed, desperately, urgently. The lord who had never listened now asked. The steward who had once fined now bargained. Death had cleared the land, and in its wake, labor became power. I walked from village to village and saw signs of change. A thatcher demanding coin, not oats. A herdsman choosing which manor to serve. Wages rose not because laws changed, but because the land could not wait. A harvest uncut meant starvation for all, and so lords opened their purses, grudgingly. It was not generosity, it was necessity, wrapped in the silence of fear and profit. Peasants who once laboured without choice now weighed their options. If a manor offered better terms, they moved. The bonds of villanage, long assumed unbreakable, began to fray. I met men who had walked days to find work where they were welcomed instead of ordered. Some were turned away, yes, but others were taken in, fed, housed, given tools. The Lord needed hands more than lineage. Those who stayed gained ground too. Lords, desperate to keep their tenants, forgave old debts, lightened labour, offered coin in place of corvée. I saw contracts written in ink, not blood, terms agreed upon, not imposed. The manor court recorded wages for reapers, carpenters, ploughmen. A new language crept in. Choice, agreement, hire. Not yet freedom, but something close enough to taste. There were murmurs, of course, whispers of revolt, of peasants growing bold. The highborn watched with wary eyes, speaking of order, of tradition. But the fields did not care for bloodlines. They needed backs and hands, and those who bore the tools now held the balance. It was not a revolt with banners, but a turning of the soil, slow, deep, unstoppable. I saw young men take pride in their work for the first time, not just in survival, but in skill. A mason who charged for each stone laid, a spinner who sold thread in her own name. The poor still bowed in chapel, but they no longer bowed so quickly in court. A posture had shifted, not arrogance, but awareness, of worth, of need, of times turning. Markets changed too. More goods moved, more coin passed. Fairs bustled not only with nobles, but with common folk selling cheese, linen, cider. A shepherd might walk home with silver in his pocket, not merely a nod from his lord. It was a strange sight at first, so much life rising from the shadow of death. But life, I've learned, does not ask permission. And so, the survivors became more than just the spared. They became sought after. Their labour was no longer assumed. It was courted. And though many still lived under heavy burdens, they walked with firmer steps. The world had cracked open, just slightly. And through that crack, a new shape began to emerge, built not with swords, but with calloused hands and quiet bargaining. The wind of change rarely blows without resistance. No sooner had peasants begun to bargain for their labour than the crown moved to halt them. In 1351, a decree came from on high, the Statute of Labourers. It fixed wages at pre-plague levels and forbade workers from leaving their manors. To ask for more, to walk away, was now a crime. The parchment bore the king's seal, but it was fear that inked the lines. I saw copies nailed to church doors, read aloud by bailiffs who knew the ink would not stop hunger. The law demanded the world return to what it was, but the world had changed. There were fewer hands, greater need, and a memory of negotiation that could not be erased. Still, lords enforced the statute where they could, some gently, others with the lash. Men were fined, jailed, even branded for seeking a better wage. Yet even the harshest enforcement could not rebuild what the plague had undone. Labourers continued to move in secret, to work under false names, to strike silent bargains far from the manor court's reach. Entire families vanished overnight, reappearing days later in new parishes with new hopes. The Lord chased shadows while the harvest ripened under freer hands. I met one such man, hoe slung over his shoulder, who said, "You cannot fence the wind." In the courts, cases piled high. Landlords complained of runaway servants, of insolent workers, of wages paid under protest. But enforcement was uneven. Some juries sided with the poor, others with the lords. The law, once clear, grew tangled in contradiction, and every season that passed under these rules without collapse only emboldened those who once feared to speak. The clergy, too, murmured against the law. Some called it unjust to fix the labourer's price, while merchants profited freely. A few brave priests preached that God had levelled the land through plague, and to resist that levelling was to mock his will. These sermons were rare, but they lit fires in quiet corners, and though bishops frowned, the words had already taken root. Among the gentry, discontent brewed differently. They lamented the loss of easy labour, the rise of defiance. Letters flew between estates, urging tighter control. Some trained their sons not only in arms, but in account-keeping, seeking order in ledgers where it had failed in the field. But no sum could alter the fact that they needed those same workers they tried to bind. Power had not left them, but it had thinned. In taverns and under hedges, common folk spoke in low voices of the law. Some cursed it, others laughed. One man told me, "They may write their will in Latin, but we answer in harvests." It was not rebellion, not yet, but it was readiness. The old balance had shifted, and the attempt to nail it in place had left the nails loose, rusting in weather that no longer obeyed the crown. Years later, the statute remained on parchment, but its power faded with each passing season. What began as command had become suggestion, and in that quiet erosion, something new began to form. Not revolution, but a reckoning. The land remembered, and so did its people. Not in anger alone, but in the steady refusal to be turned back into silence. There was a time when a man might live and die within sight of the same church steeple. But after the pestilence, the ties that held many to one place began to loosen. Fields lay untended, cottages stood empty, and opportunities sprouted where death had passed. I met travellers on roads once quiet, ploughmen, weavers, widows with children in tow, moving not from despair, but toward possibility. Their footsteps carved new paths through the old world. Many sought manors where lords, desperate for hands, offered coin or favourable terms. I passed through one village where half the tenants were newcomers, each holding leases rewritten to entice. Freedom of pasture, one man told me proudly, and no boon work beyond Candlemas. Such words would have been unthinkable in my youth, but the land, like the people, had begun to shift. Even villains once bound by birth found cracks in their chains. A change of name, a distant parish, a sympathetic reeve. These were enough to vanish into a new life. The risk was real: recapture, fines, disgrace. But for many, it was worth it. A fresh start for a child. A plot of land to call one's own. Not rebellion, but quiet refusal. Not defiance, but motion. I knew a woman who left her manor after her husband's death. She walked 40 miles with her 2 sons, seeking a town where widows were welcome as workers. She found one, and with her needle and thread, bought bread without asking leave of any lord. Her story was one of many. It was not told in books, but it echoed through villages and beyond. Towns grew with this tide of movement. Markets bustled, guilds opened to new faces, and the language of the countryside met that of the city. Skills were traded, songs shared, customs blended. There was friction, yes, but also growth. The road brought not only risk, but resilience, and for those bold enough to walk it, a future shaped by their own step. Some lords fought this flight, sending writs and sheriffs to bring back the missing, but the names they called were no longer the names worn by those they sought. The field had become a forest, the world more tangled, more free. In trying to keep still what had begun to move, they only made the current stronger. The more they chased, the farther the people ran. Mobility was not just escape, it was transformation. Families once locked into sameness began to climb. slowly, cautiously. A shepherd's son became a miller. A servant girl married into trade. The gaps between classes did not vanish, but they blurred, and where there had been stone, there was now sand. Still heavy, still hard, but shifting beneath the weight of centuries. On a quiet evening, I met a mason resting by the roadside, his pack beside him and his face weathered. "I've built walls in 10 towns," he said, "but I go where I'm needed. That's enough." He offered me a crust of bread, and we shared it beneath the sky. I never learned his name, but I knew, as I watched him walk away, that I had seen the future carried on tired feet, free, uncertain, and moving ever forward. In the corners of the village, behind hedges, and within the hum of spinning wheels, women moved the world without fanfare. Their hands churned butter, brewed ale, dyed wool, and caught babies in the stillness before dawn. These tasks were not named in manor rolls or praised from pulpits, but they sustained us just the same. I have seen more life pass through a midwife's hands than through any lord's decree. Ale was a craft few men mastered, as well as women. Brewsters, widows, wives and daughters fermented grain into sustenance, selling jugs from their doorsteps. Their brews were tested by taste and trust, and sometimes by the manor court if quality slipped. A good brew brought coin, a bad one brought fines. But many earned enough to keep a household afloat, their worth measured not in land, but in warm mugs passed hand to hand. In the dairy, women made cheese that aged in dark sheds, and curds that nourished whole families. Milk was unpredictable. Cows gave or they did not. But the skill to stretch it, preserve it, transform it, belonged to women. I watched once as a girl no older than 12 coaxed a stubborn churn into butter. She wiped her brow with pride. No parchment recorded her name, but her labor was as real as mine. Textiles offered another path. Spinning and weaving, mending and dyeing. These were not hobbies, but trades. Wool passed through calloused fingers, becoming cloth sold at market or worn for years. Some women took in work from distant towns, their looms clicking late into night. In a world where coin was scarce, a bolt of linen was wealth, and those who shaped it held quiet influence. Land, too, passed through women's hands more often than some imagine. Widows inherited plots and leased them, managed them, defended them in court. I recall one who stood before the manor steward and listed every boundary of her field by heart. No one dared challenge her. She had tilled that soil with her husband, buried him in it, and now fed her sons from it. Her authority was earned in furrows and seasons. They acted as healers too, grinding herbs into salves, steeping teas to ease cough or cramp. Some were feared for their knowledge, called witches in whispered tones when cures failed. But most were trusted more than traveling physicians. They knew the body through birth and death, through pain and recovery. Their power lay not in robes, but in the rhythm of care. Even within the church, some found quiet strength. Women organized feast days, kept candles lit, embroidered altar cloths. Their faith was not loud, but it was constant. They prayed not just for heaven, but for rain, for health, for a safe childbirth. Their piety wove through every thread of daily life, grounding the sacred in the scent of bread and the sound of children. One evening, I sat beside a hearth where 4 generations of women spun, stitched, and stirred. They spoke little, but everything they touched bore meaning. Blankets for winter, bandages for wounds, meals for the next day's labor. I left with a fuller belly and a humbled heart. For in their quiet industry, I saw a truth no scroll had ever taught, that power does not always wear a sword. Sometimes it wears an apron. I've watched children chase geese across muddy yards, their laughter rising like birds into the air. There was no childhood as we now imagine, no years set aside for play alone. From as early as 7, a child's hands were called to work. They scattered seed, carried water, gathered kindling, and shooed sparrows from the barley. They learned by doing, not by lesson, and the land was both teacher and taskmaster. Their days began with the same bell that stirred the adults, mass at dawn, chores by light. A boy might follow his father to the fields, awkward with the hoe but eager. A girl might watch her mother twist flax or strain curds, mimicking each motion in miniature. What they lacked in size, they made up for in repetition. Childhood was brief, but it built strong backs and steady habits. Play still found its way between the furrows. A walnut became a toy, a reed a whistle, a ragged doll a companion tucked beneath straw. They raced along ditches, climbed apple trees, balanced barefoot on fences. I saw once a boy pretend a turnip was a knight's helmet. His sister crowned him with thistle. They laughed until their sides ached. Even in hardship, imagination wove joy from scraps. Discipline was constant, but not always cruel. Elders taught with sharp words and sharper glances. A spilled pail might earn a swat, a broken gate, a day's silence. Yet love was not absent, only quiet. A father's pride showed in a ruffled head. A mother's worry in bread slipped beneath a blanket. Affection moved in gestures, not in speech. Hunger shaped their memories. Seasons of plenty brought bellies full and spirits high. Lean years meant skipped meals, chewing bark, or drinking thin pottage 3 times a day. But even then, children endured. They scavenged for nettles, traded eggs, shared crumbs. I once saw a boy give his only apple to his younger sister, then run barefoot through frost to distract himself from hunger. Education, for most, came only from the land. Few knew letters unless a priest took interest or a wealthy kin sent them to school. But they could read the sky, measure time by shadow, name every bird by song. A child who couldn't write could still tend a fire, milk a goat, mend a fence. That too was learning, practical, patient, passed down like a worn tool. Some were apprenticed early, sent to a carpenter, a blacksmith, a cook. Their names faded from the village, but were remembered at feast days and funerals. Others stayed close, building their lives around the very trees they'd climbed as children. No matter where they went, they carried the rhythm of the farm with them. It beat in their footsteps, softened their speech, shaped their hands. I still remember the boy who once walked beside me, holding a bundle of firewood twice his size. "I'll be a reeve one day," he said with a crooked grin. Perhaps he did, perhaps he didn't. But in his voice I heard the weight and wonder of youth forged not in freedom, but in necessity. And that, I think, is the kind of childhood that grows into quiet strength. Not all strength came from the soil or the scythe. In many villages, survival rested on the bonds between neighbours, unwritten, unforced, but firm as oak. I saw it in shared plough teams, in roofs mended by many hands, in bread left at a widow's door before dawn. These were not favours. They were the threads that stitched a village together, made from trust and repetition. When a barn collapsed or a fire stole a cottage, help arrived not in speeches but in spades. Men brought timber, women brought broth, and children carried stones. I once watched 20 people raise a new wall before sunset, their voices joined in song between hammer strikes. No lord commanded it, no priest blessed it, yet it stood stronger than anything built for coin. Guilds were rare among peasants, but they had their own forms of fellowship. Feast societies, burial clubs, and harvest circles, groups formed to spread risk and sorrow. If a man fell sick, his family was fed. If a child died, others wept with the mother and covered the cost of burial. These acts of mercy held more weight than doctrine. They were born of shared memory and common fragility. In the darkest seasons, when frost lingered and stores thinned, it was not uncommon to divide what little remained. One cottage gave oats, another onions. A few hens passed from house to house, scratching new earth each week. I remember an old man who gave his last ham to a neighbour with fever, saying only, "I've had my fill." He died that spring, but no one forgot. Quarrels still rose, of course, over hedgerows, over gossip, over goats that wandered, but more often than not, the peace was patched before it tore. A jug of ale, a shared labour, a public apology beneath the linden tree. Pride was real, but so was the need to endure together. Grudges rarely survived the planting season. Seasonal rituals reinforced the ties. Maypole dances, harvest feasts, wakes filled with food and tales. These gatherings reminded folk that joy was communal too. I recall a winter where sickness kept many indoors, yet on 12th night they gathered around a bonfire. No feast, no song, just hands extended to the heat. And in that circle of silence, they remembered they were not alone. Children learned early that help was a duty, not a favor. They carried messages between farms, fetched water for the elderly, mended fences not their own. These small acts became habits, and habits became character. It was a quiet education. How to live not just for oneself, but within a shared rhythm, one life pulsing among many. Once, in a village hit by fire and flood within the same year, I asked a woman how they had endured. She shrugged, wiping flour from her hands. "We took turns holding each other up," she said. And I understood then that strength is not always forged in solitude. Sometimes it is handed from one heart to another, across a table, through a door, or in the simple act of staying. The chapel bell called us before sunrise, its sound cutting through fog and frost like a blade. We gathered not just out of duty, but need. Faith was woven into every furrow we ploughed, every loaf we baked. God watched over the lambing and the harvest, the birthbed and the grave. We did not ask whether he listened, we simply believed he must. Without that, what could hold the world together? Mass was more than ritual, it was rhythm. We knelt beside those we quarreled with, crossed ourselves beside those we loved. The Latin passed over us like wind, half understood, wholly trusted. The priest raised the host and we bowed our heads, not because we were told, but because the moment felt bigger than breath. We left with soot on our boots and ash on our foreheads, walking into fields as into scripture. Pilgrimages offered a deeper devotion. I've walked beside men with blistered feet, singing through pain, each step a prayer, to Canterbury, to Walsingham, to shrines tucked into forests. They sought healing, forgiveness, a sign, and if they found nothing but the road, still they returned lighter. Sometimes the journey was the blessing, sometimes the silence on the hill was louder than a sermon. Fear crept in when prayers went unanswered. A cow died, a child fell ill, the sky withheld rain. We whispered to saints and lit candles before crude icons, hoping for mercy. If hail flattened the barley, we searched our souls for sins. A cracked well might mean a cursed field. We sought scapegoats, not always justly, and sometimes blamed those too different, too wise, too silent. But faith also gave comfort no other force could offer. In the deepest cold, we believed heaven watched. In the darkest grief, we imagined our dead not lost, but waiting. Stories of miracles warmed our nights. A blind man who saw, a breadbasket that never emptied. We knew the tales were old, perhaps stretched, but still we told them. Hope clings best to the edges of truth. Our saints were not distant. They walked among us in carvings, in songs, in herbs pinned to doorways. Saint Cuthbert for cattle, Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Barbara against thunder. We invoked them as one calls to kin, asking not for grandeur, but for survival. And sometimes we swore we felt them answer, in a dream, in a breeze, in a moment when the fever broke and the child breathed easier. The sacred blended with the everyday. A plough was blessed at Epiphany, a field sprinkled with holy water, bread shared in Christ's name on Easter morning. These acts were not separate from work, they sanctified it. I watched a man draw a cross in the dirt before sowing seed. No words, just motion. It was faith made flesh, kneeling quietly in the mundane. One dusk, I sat with a dying woman whose hands clutched a wooden rosary worn smooth with use. "I hope he remembers me," she whispered. I held her hand as she passed, and I believed then and now that he did. For if faith cannot see us through the silence, then it is only noise. But if it can carry us even one step further, then it is worth every whispered prayer. The skies changed slowly, without trumpet or omen. Winters lengthened, springs came late, and summers lost their warmth. We called it simply bad weather at first, blaming sin, the stars, or the wind. But as years passed, patterns formed. Crops failed not once, but again and again. I remember snow in May, and rivers frozen solid by All Saints' Day. The sun still rose, but it offered little. Grain yields shrank. Barley turned patchy, rye grew thin, and hay rotted in the fields before it could be cut. Pastures flooded more often, and the ground stayed wet beneath our boots well into planting season. Hunger crept closer, quieter than in famine, but steadier. Not starvation, but a constant narrowing of the belt, a quiet weighing of every crumb. We ate less and worried more. Frost reached places it never had before. Orchards gave fewer apples, and vineyards withered in the north. Bread changed, more husks, less wheat. Pottage thinned, animals struggled to fatten, and fewer calves survived. I saw entire villages shift their diet, leaning heavier on beans and root vegetables, anything that grew short and low to the ground. The land no longer promised, it warned. Adaptation became necessity. We turned to hardier grains, oats, rye, and later, buckwheat. Farmers drained low fields more carefully, dug deeper trenches, and watched the clouds with new suspicion. A good harvest became rare enough to celebrate with real awe. One year, I helped build a granary, not to hold plenty, but to guard what little we had. It stood like a fortress in a starving land. Shepherds fared better than ploughmen. As crop fields failed, pastures still gave wool and sometimes meat. More land turned to grazing, more labour turned to sheep. I walked with flocks through frosted valleys, wrapped in coarse cloaks, watching for wolves. Wool brought trade, and trade brought coin. In some places, it meant survival. In others, it meant enclosure, and yet more change. Villagers learned to store hay with greater care, building taller stacks beneath canvas and thatch. Herbs were dried in larger quantities. Firewood was rationed. Windows were sealed with rags. Even the houses changed. Hearths made deeper, thresholds raised against flood. The cold shaped us, not only in hunger, but in posture. We moved slower, spoke less, waited more. Some blamed witches, others blamed kings. A few wise ones observed the sun and spoke of cycles, but most of us simply endured. No decree could warm the soil, no prayer could chase the fog. And yet, we did not collapse. We adjusted. With each bitter year, we became quieter, harder, more aware of one another. The weather taught humility better than any sermon. I sat once in a cottage where the walls were thick with turf, and the only warmth came from a single peat fire. The family inside wore layers sewn from scraps, their breath visible in the lamplight. And yet, they offered me broth and space by the hearth. "Cold's been here before," the father said. "We know its name." And in his voice, I heard not fear, but knowledge, that even when the sky forgets its warmth, we need not forget each other. One morning, long before the rooster's call, I heard the sound of hooves on frozen ground. Not the steady pace of a merchant or a lord's party, but the sharp, scattered rhythm of soldiers. War had arrived, not with banners raised high, but with carts, mud, and hungry eyes. We had known it would come. Still, the first glimpse shook us like thunder. Men in armour, faces hidden, taking what they needed and offering little in return. It wasn't always enemies we feared. Sometimes the king's own men passed through, demanding grain, lodging, or shelter for their horses. Refusing meant risk, compliance meant hardship. I've seen pigs slaughtered on the spot, hay taken from beneath the oxen's bellies. For the crown, they'd say. But the crown did not plough the fields nor raise the lambs. The weight of loyalty pressed hard on empty tables. Villages closest to the front lines fared the worst. Crops trampled, women harassed, churches looted not by strangers, but by those meant to protect. I once stood beside a priest who watched soldiers strip his altar of brass and linen. He wept not from anger, but from exhaustion. They bless themselves before battle, he said, then steal from the house of God. It was a grief too old to rage. Those who could hid what they had. Livestock driven into woods, grain buried in pits, valuables tucked beneath hearthstones. Children learned silence, and dogs were taught not to bark. The sound of galloping made hearts freeze. A lord's seal on a letter offered no guarantee. In war, the poor bled first and longest. Some villagers fled entirely, carrying what they could on carts or backs, vanishing into forests or neighboring parishes. I met a mother once with 3 children and 1 blanket between them. Better cold than a soldier's door, she told me. Her eyes held no hate, only the dull edge of weariness. She had walked 4 days without rest. I shared my crust, and she shared her silence. Churches sometimes served as refuge, thick stone walls, iron-bound doors, but even they could fall. More than once, I've seen sanctuaries turn to stables, pews broken for firewood. The cross above the altar could not shield against hunger or steel. Yet still, people knelt beneath it, praying for safety in a language older than any king's command. There were moments of kindness amid the ruin. A soldier who gave a child a cloak, a commander who spared a granary when begged by a midwife. These gestures glowed faintly in the long shadow of violence. They reminded us that not all who wore armor had lost their hearts. But such moments were rare, and we learned not to trust their arrival. I walked through a village once, years after the war had moved on. The roofs had been rebuilt, the fields replanted, but the fear still lived in the corners. Doors were barred earlier, voices kept low. Scars in the soil heal slowly, and those in the soul, slower still. Yet wheat rose again, and so did we. Not because peace had come, but because we had outlasted the storm. Even in the hardest years, joy found its way through the cracks. It crept in with song, with warm bread, with firelight dancing on smiling faces. On feast days, we set our burdens aside and remembered laughter. Banners were raised, benches laid with what food we could spare, and children ran wild with ribbons in their hair. The tolling bell called not to prayer, but to gathering. For a few hours, the village breathed as one. The calendar offered its share of celebration. Candlemas, Easter, Lammas, and Michaelmas. Each brought a different rhythm: the blessing of seed, the breaking of fast, the sharing of loaves, the end of harvest. On these days, even the poorest brought something: an egg, a song, a tale. We ate together, not because there was plenty, but because the moment demanded it. It was gratitude shaped into gathering. At midsummer, fires blazed high into the night, sparks flying into stars. We danced around them, barefoot and bold, old and young alike. I remember one girl leaping through the flames, her laugh ringing like bells. Some said it brought luck, others said it was folly, but no one stopped her. Such nights reminded us we were still alive, still burning against the dark. Fairs brought colour and noise beyond the familiar. Traders set up stalls with fabrics from distant towns, pots glazed blue, spices sharp and strange. Jugglers performed, minstrels strummed, and laughter mingled with the bleating of goats and the clang of coins. I once bought a whistle carved from bone, worth nothing and everything. The fair was not just for buying, it was for wonder. Couples courted beneath the maypole, hands brushing shyly as garlands were tied. Children clutched sweetmeats and stared wide-eyed at painted puppets. Even the reeves smiled on such days. Disputes were forgotten, debts postponed, and even lords sometimes joined in the merriment, handing out ale with a rare chuckle. For once, there was no difference between hearth and hall. Music wove through it all. Pipes, fiddles, the thrum of drums beaten by eager palms. Songs that told of heroes and fools, of lost love and good harvests. We knew the words by heart, passing them down like heirlooms. A good song could soften a heart, mend a quarrel, seal a promise. I have seen a feud end with a shared chorus and 2 mugs of ale. Behind the joy lay effort. Women baking from dawn, men raising tents, boys gathering kindling. Celebration was its own kind of labor, but lighter, sweeter. We gave our best to these moments because they gave something back. Memory, laughter, the glue that held us through the harder days. The feast was not escape, it was renewal. I recall a winter after famine, when the feast of Epiphany came quiet, with only broth and bread. Still we gathered. One child sang a carol too loudly, and the old widow beside me laughed until she wept. That night, I understood something simple. Joy is not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to let it swallow everything. And in that defiance, we found life again. The change came not with trumpets, but with ink. In manor roles, the language began to shift, less of owed labor and more of leased land. Fewer fines for fleeing, more entries for contracts. The weight of custom, once as solid as stone, began to soften. Lords still held their titles, but the bond between master and peasant grew thinner, thread by quiet thread. Freedom did not come in waves, it seeped in like water through wood. Service, once demanded, was now sometimes commuted for coin. A man, who once gave days to the domain, could now pay to keep his time. This was not generosity, it was pragmatism. Lords, stretched thin by war or plague, needed silver more than sweat. And peasants, weary of bending backs for another's gain, saw a chance to claim a sliver of control. Coin, though scarce, became the language of new bargains. Land changed hands more freely. A widow sold her strip to a neighbor. A former villain leased a fallow plot and planted beans. Transactions once hidden in shadow came into the open. Manor courts recorded them carefully, but the tone had changed. It was no longer just about enforcement, it was about agreement. Rights were still uneven, but they were beginning to be named. I remember a reeve who once fined his own cousin for harvesting early. Years later, I saw the same man draw up a lease for that cousin, signed with an X and sealed with wax. They laughed as they worked, not as equals, but as men bound less by fear than by function. It was a small thing, yet it echoed wider than the field they walked. These shifts brought friction. Some lords clung tighter, reasserting old demands, punishing those who stepped too far. Others embraced the new order, eager for stability, for profit, for less burden on their own purse. Villages too were divided. Some saw freedom in the change, others saw danger. But all felt the tremor beneath their feet. No single event marked the turn. It came in fragments, a contract here, a legal challenge there, a dispute settled in favor of the tenant. Over time, the language of serf gave way to tenant, and the idea of bondage began to rot at its core. Not everywhere, and not quickly, but undeniably. A door once sealed had begun to open. Young men spoke of new towns where no lord claimed their labor, where land could be leased with only a handshake and a coin. They left behind the village bells, the manor fields, and the shadow of inherited servitude. Some returned with coin, others with stories, but all returned changed. Mobility was no longer a sin, it was a sign of possibility. I met a girl once who tended sheep on her father's leased land. She carried herself not with pride, but with certainty. No one owns me, she said, matter of fact, as she mended a fence post. That simple truth, quiet, firm, unshaken, was more powerful than any charter. For in her voice, I heard the echo of a new age being born, not in courts, but in the hearts of those who had once bowed. There's something about walking an old path barefoot. The earth remembers. Each step presses into memory, worn smooth by generations. I used to trace those furrows left by ploughs long vanished, feel the ridges carved by wheels, and wonder whose hands had steadied the reins. Though their names are mostly lost, their labor endures beneath each harvest. The land is their ledger, and it forgets nothing. Every stone wall, crooked and mossy, holds stories. Built without mortar, they still stand, shaped by backs bowed under toil and eyes squinting through sun or snow. Some were boundary lines, others shelter for beasts, but all were acts of will. I leaned once against a wall older than any living soul, and in its silence, it spoke of endurance. That kind of legacy cannot be bought. Tools rusted, barns collapsed, and yet the field stayed ploughed. That was their final triumph. They taught their children, who taught theirs, not just how to sow or reap, but how to live with patience. They knew hunger, loss, oppression, but also songs, laughter, and hands that reached for others in the dark. It was not a romantic life, but it was rooted in something real. In winter, when snow blanketed the village and hearths crackled behind shuttered windows, you could still hear it. The quiet pride in stories passed down. A grandfather recalling how he once brought in the last sheaf with bloodied palms. A grandmother telling how she traded onions for candles so the children wouldn't sleep in darkness. They weren't kings, but they had carved out their place. Even the graveyards whispered it. Wooden crosses leaned like old men, and names faded from stone, but the flowers kept blooming. Peasants buried their dead with no grand rites, just a prayer, a spade, and the faith that life, somehow, would go on. Some graves had no marker at all, only the memory kept alive in tales and habits. Their reward wasn't heaven, it was being remembered. The rhythm of their lives shaped more than the countryside. It shaped customs, languages, diets, even justice. Much of what we call tradition began in their kitchens, fields, and firelit gatherings, not because they sought legacy, but because they endured. They made do, made meaning, made time matter. That, in itself, was a kind of genius. When I see a field tilled just before rain, or a loaf scored in a cross before baking, I see echoes of them. In every clumsy scarecrow and every child chasing geese, there's a fragment of 1,000 lives once counted as nothing. But they were the bones of the world. Without them, the castles would have crumbled, the markets emptied, the prayers gone unheard. I once stood on a ridge at dawn, watching light spread across furrows like golden threads. And I thought, this is what they left us, not riches, not monuments, but the stubborn, sacred act of continuing. They survived plagues, hunger, and cruel lords, and in surviving, they sowed something greater than grain. They sowed us. The fire has burned low now, dear traveller, its embers pulsing softly beneath the ash. My voice, like the night wind, has grown quiet, spent from the long journey we walked together through the soil and sorrow of those who came before us. I think often of their strength, not carved in marble or etched in scrolls, but woven into each footstep they left across the fields. Their silence was not emptiness, but endurance. And in that silence, we hear the hum of 1,000 lives still echoing beneath our own. So I thank you, friend, for lending your ear and your stillness. The stars remain above us, patient and unblinking, as they once watched over the huddled huts and plough-split furrows of a distant age. Rest now, if you can. Let the weight of what was sink gently through your thoughts like mist over morning fields. I shall keep watch a little longer, for old habits die slow.